Hi, and welcome to the pharmacovigilance lecture. In this lecture, I'll try to give a very quick summary of pharmacovigilance, and I'll have a more industry-focused point of view because that is where I come from. So during my studies, I worked in the pharmacovigilance department as a student in a drug company. And then after my studies, I worked for a year approximately also in pharmacovigilance. So that is why this lecture will be a little bit more industry focused compared to the rest. So what is pharmacovigilance and why is this so important? So pharmacovigilance is the science and activities related to the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse events or any other drug-related problems. And there are multiple explanations about pharmacovigilance on different websites, such as from the EMA website, so the European Medical Agency website. There's from the World Health Organization, so the WHO, and also multiple other sites where they have a very similar explanation of what pharmacovigilance is. And that's also why it's so important, because we want to give the patients the best product and also protect them. So we'll be very focused on the patient safety and also the drug safety when they have to use the drug. And therefore we want to prevent the adverse effects. But it's very hard to find all the adverse effects, especially in clinical trials, because you have a very limited population. So that's why pharmacovigilance is very, very, very dominant in the post-marketing phase, which is the phase after the drug is approved. So here you would be trying to detect by collecting different adverse event reports from patients and health professionals, and then you'll try to do some kind of assessment of all of those reports to try to understand the adverse effects. And also said it's very dominant in the post-marketing surveillance. So if you look at this pipeline, drug development pipeline, so you have everything from drug discovery until the post-marketing surveillance. So that's when the drug is on the market. Mainly the pharmacovigilance is in the it's mainly in the post-marketing surveillance area. So when the drug is on the market, but they're also a little bit involved in the clinical trials because they are the one with a lot of knowledge about the safety on drugs. So they will typically also be a little bit involved in the clinical trials, maybe not as much, but they will typically be a little bit involved. A little bit about the history of pharmacovigilance. So the pharmacovigilance, it has been through some evolutions throughout the time, and this timeline here is very rough overview of when different things happened. So if you look at this timeline, we have 1884, so around the 1800s and 1900s, there were a lot of cases or scandals, if you can say, which did spark a lot of outcry from a lot of different people. And one of those, I would say, scandals or tragedies were involving children. So those were also extra charged with emotion and also provoked action. So in 1848, there was also a child who died from some chloroform anesthesia during a treatment, and that sparked some reports in journals where the journalists invited physicians to submit any reports related to anesthesia death. And likewise in the US, you had also some formulations of solvent diethyl glycol, which was used in sulfonamide tablets, which was used to treat streptococcal infections. So it was used to treat infections. And this, I would say they called it elixir, which contained this solvent. that caused a lot of children to die. And all of these things that sparked the FDA, or a change in the FDA to be more of a watchdog instead of just confiscating misbranded products. So they got a newer role where they had a more vision of an FDA which was responsible for regulating potentially hazardous medical products, and that was the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So if we now jump to the 1961, which is the one where it says McBride's letter about tragedy of thalidomide. So that is a very big case that you might or you may hear a lot during your studies. So because it had a very big impact in a lot of drug development and also drug safety. So that I would say scandal or tragedy, it did change a lot of the drug focus or drug safety focus from being more reactive to being more proactive. And it also led to some development of specific safety surveillances before marketing and also after it getting on the markets, so the drugs. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide. So yeah, as you can see on the timeline, there has been like changes. Um, reactions from or more reactive to different things that happens, and then having a program established or some how to say regulatory actions and legislations based on those. So if we now move to the thalidomide disaster, which was one of the, how to say, biggest changes to regulation of drugs worldwide, because it shifted. This was one of the things that shifted the focus of the drug safety on a worldwide basis from being very reactive to being more proactive. So the thalidomide, or the drug, it was called Distaval, and the company had back then advertised it as a drug, or a drug that can be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers without adverse effect on mother or child. So the drug was prescribed for a range of conditions, and one of them being relieving the symptoms of nausea often experienced in early pregnancy. So the drug, it was used worldwide in many different countries over the world, and scientists, they didn't really exactly know how the drug worked, so how it could pass through different barriers in the body and so on. And in addition, tests weren't really done involving pregnant females, so it was hard saying what the effect would be. And at the end, it took about 5 years for a connection between the thalidomide, or the drug, taken by pregnant women and the impact on the children that had been made. So for all the women, or for a lot of the women that took this drug, that caused birth defects in the children that was born from these women. And an estimation of the amount of babies that were affected worldwide was over 10,000 babies that was born with birth defects, and some even died within months of being born. So how was this found out? So this drug, it was marketed around 1950s or mid 1950s, and in the beginning of around 1957, it was seen that there was a significant spike in the number of cases of birth defects, and a few doctors, they reported seeing these. Then if we now jump to 1961, so a couple of years after, that was a big change in the European pharmacovigilance, and that happened after this letter, or this, I would say, report. So this was a report by McBride, which was an Australian doctor who wrote a letter to this journal, Lancet, where he suggested that there was or there might be a connection between the congenital abnormalities and of babies and the thalidomide, because he had observed that there was a higher number of these congenital malformations of babies in the women that had taken this thalidomide during pregnancy. And at the same time, there was also another doctor in Germany who had also suggested a correlation between these two things, and he published that, or he published his suspicions in a German journal, and that then sparked a lot of different like legislation being developed after some years after this, and also a new structure in the UK called the Yellow Card Scheme, which was a scheme or program to help collect the adverse event informations. I previously said that thalidomide was marketed worldwide. However, that is not completely true, because thalidomide never got to US. So in the US, they never had a thalidomide disaster, because it never reached the US. So back in the days, or back during this time, they had a medical reviewer at the FDA who rejected the application for thalidomide because she found it lacking sufficient evidence. So she had requested additional information and determined, among some other shortcomings, that the drug had some chronic toxicity studies that were not long enough, and it also contained some inadequate absorption data for the application. So the FDA never approved the drug, and also never approved the use of the drug in USA. And that, at the end of the day, was a good thing, because then they never got the thalidomide. This also evolved the surveillance worldwide even more. So different countries develop different regulatory mechanism for also monitoring the drug safety. Like for example, in the US, they passed some amendments to their drug development to also focus a bit more on the testing and marketing of the product. If we now move into a more into the company or drug company perspective, you will have different teams with different activities in those teams, and overall those teams in the pharmacovigilance part would be a pharmacovigilance team, a medical affairs team, regulatory team, a risk management team, and they all have different tasks that they have to do, and sometimes the structure will also vary a bit in different companies. So for example, pharmacovigilance team and medical affairs team could be one team under the umbrella of medical affairs, and also sometimes the risk management team would also be in the same team as the pharmacovigilance, but so you'll have different people, and also doing different tasks, but within the same team. But overall, this is a distinction that you can do between the different teams. So if we take some of the team's tasks one by one, so if we have the pharmacovigilance team, so those are the ones that are primarily handling the adverse event cases. So that would be when a reporter reports an adverse event case. So this reporter could be everything from a patient, consumer of the drug, to a physician, a pharmacist, basically anyone can be a reporter here. So they would take in this case, so the case intake, they'll take the case, then they'll process the case, so go through everything with case entering and also evaluating the case for safety and so on. And then this case would then be reported to the regulatory authorities, So that could be the different competent authorities in the country, or it could also be like EMA, it could be US, so the FDA. Um, and this, and apart from this, then if they don't have enough information for the cases, then they'll also need to follow up with the reporter again to see if they can get more information. So for example, it could be which other drugs were the patient taking at the same time to see maybe there was some interaction between the drugs. And then finally, they also need to do literature review. So they also would need to screen the literature for for adverse event cases to enter in the database, because they need a very broad overview of everything to see if there are some specific adverse events that are popping up that you wouldn't maybe have seen during the clinical trials. Then in the medical affairs team, so they also have so all the regulatory reporting, so all the reports that the pharmacovigilance team they sent to the regulatory authorities, those would also go through the medical affairs. So they will use all of these reports to first of all detect signals of new adverse events that you might not have seen during clinical trials. It could also be changes in the adverse event numbers, so maybe the risk is lower, or maybe you'll see that, this adverse events only specifically happens if you use this other drug. Then that could also be in their their review. So that's also why they do a cumulative review, so where they pool all of the data together to get a big comprehensive overview of everything. Then they also verify the different risks and benefits. So they also need to assess the drugs on a periodic basis to see if the risk benefit ratio is still good enough to be on the market, or if the risk is too high, and then maybe the drug would have to be taken off the market. And then that will go through a signal amplification studies if they need to do some studies so if they maybe see some signals for the risk benefit, but the signals isn't high enough, then they might need to amplify those signals, and they have different statistical methods to do that, but that's not something we need to go in to in this lecture. And then for the regulatory team, those are the ones that handle all the regulatory aspects. So for example, they need to update the risk profile. So if the medical affairs team, they find some risk and benefits that might need to then go into the risk profiles, then the regulatory team needs to update those. It could be like updating the patient leaflet, so where all information about the drugs is stated. So they might need to update that. That will then also go into the different, so we have some REMs and RMPs. So that is basically the US version and the EU version. So for the REMs, that stands for the risk and evaluation and mitigation strategies, and the RMPs, those are the risk management plans. So for the risk management plans, they provide information about a medicine safety profile. And important here is that this plan, it describes the activity of the drug companies to further characterize the safety profile while the medication is still on the market, and also explains the different measures that are taken in order to prevent or minimize the medicine's risk in patients. And then they will also coordinate some of the post-marketing studies and past studies. So those two is also, you have a US version and you have a EU version, and they're very similar to each other. There are some mild differences, but it's not very big. So if we take the EU version, so that's the past studies. So those are the post-authorization safety studies. So these studies, they're conducted to gain more information on the medicine's safety or to measure effectiveness of risk management measures. And these can be either clinical trials or non-interventional studies. So those are studies where the researcher has as little influence as possible on like the patient condition while studying. So in other words, we want it to be very according to real life conditions. So that's where they're treated by physician, and that's according to guidelines. And then for the final team, there's the risk management team. So here they need to do some risk communication, so communicate the risks and other things to the different stakeholders. They also need to come up with some risk minimization plans, so how can we minimize these risks that we find. And then they also need to assess the risk that are found. And then the things that all of these different teams they find, all of these tasks from different teams, they're then included into aggregated reports, which are reports that examine and summarize all the safety experiences with a specific medicinal product. So that's like all the cases, like summarized, the different signals, different risks, and stuff like that. And these reports then include stuff such as the benefit risk assessment, as I said, of the adverse drug reactions. It also has the serious adverse events, and then also reports about pregnancy during the drug exposure, overdose, and lack of efficacy, because those are important for the regulatory authorities to know. So here we have a very, I'm gonna say, very condensed overview of the pharmacovigilance activities. And like the overall, if you want to summarize it, it is to collect the data, collate, analyze, and communicate. So we get a lot of different data in. So from all like from spontaneous reports, which I'll go through in a little bit, you have like clinical trials, regulatory reports, and literature. All of those data or informations that you get, those are all entered into a database. So that's the database entry. And then from that database entry, you'll then review the data. So it's here that you can also like detect signals and generate signals. Those reviews are then outputted into different measures. So for example, the risk management plan, and like also issue and crisis management. So if there is any crises, how are you going to manage those? You can also update the patient leaflet or prescribing information. So that's also like the little leaflet that the patient gets with the drug. You might have to submit those reports to authorities. You might need to review some marketing status. So should your drug still be on the market? And then you also need to send all of the cases to the different authorities, which we'll go through after or in another slide. So I talked about the cases. That is very, like, that's one of the important things in pharmacovigilance, the cases. So what is this and how's the flow? So all of these cases that can be reports to receive from any source, so patient, consumer, healthcare professional, such as pharmacist, a doctor, and so on. Like all of those can be cases, as long as they have adverse events and a patient and a drug. So these cases, we receive those. So we're at the first step, so the adverse event, so that's AE, case reception. So here we first receive the case from a source. Then we need to triage this source, so we need to find out, do we have this case already? Like, has it been reported once already? And then we need to assign different case priorities, because you need to make sure, for example, the very serious ones, those need to be reported first. And like a serious one could be a case where someone has died. So you really need to like figure out, is it your drug that caused the death or not? So those usually have a very top priority and needs to also be reported to authorities very fast. Then you assess the event. So here you look at the narrative for the review. So that is how like the case is described. So you have a big description of the case, and then you would assess it from a medical perspective and also from a safety perspective. So here you would typically have two people that assess those two. So for example, you could have a medical doctor assessing the medical perspective, and then you could have a guy such as me who have studied pharmacy or pharmaceutical science that would then look at the safety perspective to see if there's any causal relations there, or if we think there's any causal relation, then you would want to process the follow-up information. So that's step 4 now. So if you receive additional information, so you might go to or go back to the doctor that reported the events, or maybe it was a consumer that reported it, then you might go back to the consumer. Then you would go back and ask, hey, do you have anything else to report? Because we really need more information before we can actually make some kind of assessment of your case. And then typically you won't get a lot more information because people need to spend time on reporting all of these things. But sometimes you also get the extra information, and then you can actually get more information for a case to make it easier to get a complete picture of what happened. Then these cases, it will then go into the risk-benefit analysis. So that's number 5. So here you would have, for example, a risk management team member assess the risk-benefit of the specific case, and also compare it to all the other reports that we have gotten at the company. So you will also have different backgrounds there, like you could have physicians, pharmacists, like a healthcare, someone with a healthcare background. And then we go to number 6, which is the regulatory submission. So here you would then prepare that case report, so the adverse event case report. You prepare that one, and then there's different formats that the different reports need to be in, and then you will submit those to the regulatory. So that could be EMA, or it could be the Dutch Medicine Evaluation Board, specifically Liang, that does it in Netherlands. So you would then submit it to one of those, and then because they also need a report so they can keep track of what has happened to the drug. So that is in general the flow of the different cases and how it goes in the system. If we then go into the reporting of adverse events, so there's a lot of different ways to report it, and also depending on what country you are. So for example, you could, if you look on the left side first, there's a side effect reporting form. So that's the Canadian one. So here a consumer or a patient can fill out this form, and then they can send this form to the health authorities, and health professionals can also do that. So, and then the health authorities will then also forward that, either if it's a European one, they'll forward it to the EMA, who will then forward it to the company, or maybe they'll just forward it directly to the company. Other ways to do that, like in other countries, so for example, the bottom one, that is the Dutch one, so you can also report it directly to LARAP. So that's also a web page there where you can just very easily report it. And then companies will also accept these side effect reports. So for example, if we have the middle one, that one is Amgen, so a specific company. So there you can also, here they will describe how can you report these things to them. And then one on the right side, that is one from Novartis. So there you can also select specifically which country you're from, and then you can report it to the country specific one, because it's the country specific people that handle the cases. So if you are Danish and you report a case in Denmark, then it'll be the Danish team that report that handle that adverse event. And likewise, if you're in Netherlands, then it will be a Dutch team. And here, so they have some specific things that you need to include. and that's the like very minimum information. And then if the either company or regulatory authorities they want more information, then they'll typically follow up once or twice. And if that is not successful because you're not mandated by law to actually reply them, then they'll say, okay, this is the case, this is all the information we have because we don't, maybe the consumer or the patient or doctor doesn't want to give more information, then that is what they'll base their assessment on. Then regarding the adverse event reports, so there are, like very roughly, there's two types of reports that the pharmacovigilance team can receive. So those are the solicited and unsolicited reports. And I've tried to make a very quick chart here to split what is what. So for solicited reports, those are not spontaneous. So those are typically ones that we kind of expect that we'll get. So those can be like reports from trials, so clinical trials, because like now we have made a trial, that might happen something, so we are expecting it. Same with patient use programs. So those are programs that, for example, like an example of such patient use program could be a program which provides the patient and physicians with marketed approved medication, but which is not available in their own country. So then you might also like assume or expect that you will get something from there. And then you have the planned information gathering. So that's also, you kind of know that you're going to expect it because you have planned these things. So those are the solicited reports. And then for the unsolicited reports, those are the ones that we typically categorize as spontaneous reports and scientific literature. So if we start with the scientific literature, so we can have like different case reports in the literature that describe some kind of adverse event linked with a drug, and you have some patients in it, and that will then have to be, then the company has to enter those into their system to also have an overview of those. And then finally, the spontaneous reports. Those are the reports by any health professional or consumer, or patient, to the company, authority, or other organization. And those can be like, typically you say that you can almost get the reports from anywhere, because so currently companies that not expect to screen external websites, so the digital web, for adverse events, but if they do become aware of adverse events, they should review it as spontaneous reports. So that means that, for example, you could also get adverse reports from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and so on, if you become aware of those. And that is specifically for if the company is not managing that website. That is also cases where the company is managing some kind of website where you can have some kind of comment section where patient will then also maybe comment something like I experienced this and that with this drug, blah 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 blah, and then that would also be a adverse event that the company needs to look at. So it basically can come from anywhere. And then these reports that we get, so typically, or the biggest part of adverse events that we get is from the spontaneous reporting. So that is the big part of the pharmacovigilance and the different cases that they get. And all of these cases, like one specific case is a individual case study report. So that's the ICSRs. So those are documents that contain information about the adverse event and the product reported by the reporter. So that is typically one patient with this, like these adverse events and products. So you can have multiple adverse events in the same report. You'll just list them as all suspected adverse events, or maybe causal ones. And typically you will get the report. So a reporter, example, would be a physician, would then say this, like according to this physician's knowledge, this is a causal relation. So then they'll say that there is causality, and then the company will also do some causality assessment. However, the company's causality assessment cannot overrule the doctor's. Um, so in addition to that, there are some minimum details for a valid ICSR, so a valid individual case study report. So that's the spontaneous reports. So for the spontaneous reports to be valid, they need to have 4 different information. So they need to have, first of all, an identifiable reporter. So that can be a specific doctor or a specific pharmacist. Then they need a single patient. So that maybe is a patient who visited the physician. Then they need a medicinal product. So that can be, so that is typically one of the products from that company. If it's not a like if the how to say, if the report doesn't contain the company's product, then typically either they will forward it or they will just not really look at it because it's not their case, if you would say. And then finally, they need to have an adverse event. So that can be anything from nausea, headache, if we're talking about how to say, pregnancy and like giving birth, then it can be like fetal status of the baby, like for example the heartbeat. So those are all adverse events. Specific for if it's a pregnancy case, so where there's a mother and a child or fetus, then that would usually result in a mother and a child case because you need to register both and then link those two together. And then additionally, these cases can then be categorized as serious or non-serious. So for the serious cases, that is any untoward medical occurrences that might result in one of these following. So like death and life-threatening cases are very serious because we really need to make sure it's not the drug that are causing these things, or we hope not at least. And they also need to go to the regulatory authorities very fast. Then there's also hospitalization or prolonging of hospitalization that is considered serious. And then like persistent disability, birth defect, or a medical important, and that is according to the medical professional. So for example, the doctor. So if the doctor says this is important, this adverse event is very important, then that would also be a serious case. So if any of these things are not included into the report, then, the reported case report from a reporter, then we will count as non-valid ICSR or non-valid case, and then that wouldn't go further into our system than just answering and saying non-valid. Then specifically for a lot of these, how to say, regulatory authorities and industries and how to record all of these adverse events. So they have a specific, how to say, terminology to use, and those are the MEDRA terms. So MEDRA stands for Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Authorities. It's clinically validated by and is internationally used, and that's for all the regulatory authorities and regulated industries. So here you have different groups how to say, categorize your drug, or not your drug, to categorize your adverse event. So you have from the top is very not specific, and then you have very specific at the end. So those are system organ class, and then you have a high level group, high level term, preferred term, and lowest level term. Typically we just use the preferred term, so because that is like it's very specific but not the most specific ones. So for all of the adverse events, we have to link um, like a specific term from METRA to the adverse event that is reported by the reporter. And then very important to know is that the same preferred term, so for example, if we have the example influenza on the right side, that can actually link to two different system organ classes. And the system organ classes is, for example, gastrointestinal disorders, infections, or respiratory disorders. So because influenza can both be like an infection, and it also is in respiratory, respiratory disorders, then it will be in both of these two groups. But one of them would then be the primary one, and then the other one would be the secondary one. And you can change that if you really need to, but it's not that often that you do that. And this with the secondary and primary one is mainly very important when they have like some very specific queries that they need to run when they're looking at different signals. For example, you would have a query that's like gets all the different cardiovascular diseases into one big group, and then you can see like in this big group of cardiovascular diseases, how does it look, like how many events and so on. So that's why you have like primary and secondary, and then also different levels for describing that specific condition or adverse event. Then for the evaluation of the reported events, so that's the adverse events. So it's very important here that we can evaluate the adverse event in relation to the drug to see if maybe there is some causal relationship or not. And one of those ways to do it is using the Naranjo algorithm, which is an algorithm used to calculate the score for how likely the medication is the cause of the adverse event. So I have here posted the Naranjo algorithm, and you have the different scores, like for example yes and no, and you can also have don't know. So some of the yeses will give minus or plus, and some of the no's will give minus or plus or nothing. But it's basically a lot, like 10 questions to help you decide if like the adverse event is related to the medication, like if it's definite, probable, possible, or doubtful. So such questions could be, has there been any previous reports on the reaction? Like did it appear after the suspected drug was administered? And also like if you took the drug away and then gave it again, did it come back? So such questions would then help you in trying to determine whether it is caused by a drug or not. And in the medical companies, it's not always they're using this specific score. So I have been in 2 different ones where they didn't use this score, but they would then try to evaluate the reaction based on the mechanism of action for the drug. So we would be looking at how the drug was producing an effect in the body. It could also be looking at how long did it take for the drug to get out of the system in the body, and so that would be the half-life of the drug. So how fast the drug was eliminated from the body, and then that decision would then help us, or these mechanism would then help us evaluate if we think this is causal or not. So we had to write a little, I would say, a summary of what we think and why we think it's caused or not. Then there are different authorities that need to know of all of these case reports. So I've just called them ICSRs for now, so the individual case safety reports. So those are mainly the spontaneous reports because we have a lot of those. And there are different timelines for all of these reports. So there's three ones overall. So we have the within 7 calendar days from day zero, which is when the company receives the report or the I would say adverse event report. So from that day when they receive it, and then within 7 days, it needs to be submitted to the medical company. So here we're working with calendar days, so that's including the weekends and holidays. So if it's within 7 days, so that is all of the cases, which include death, life-threatening, all suspected unexpected serious adverse reaction cases. So those are the very hardcore, this needs to be reported ASAP cases. Then we have the within 15 calendar days, so that is all the serious cases which are not part of the 7 days. And then finally, we have like 90 days, which are all the non-serious cases. And all of these cases that needs to be reported to authorities. Some authorities is still fairly new, so they're still trying to work out how soon they want the different reports. But these are the general guidelines that we have. So for example, if we have the drug company and we want to report to, for example, the Danish Medicines Agency or the Dutch one. So for those two, so that's a lot of the European ones, that will go through your drug vigilance, so the EMA one. The drug company will report the case to EMA, and then the EMA will forward that, or the different countries can go into the system themselves to collect those cases. And likewise, if the physicians or patient have reported directly to the country authorities, then they'll then just go the other way around. So then the Danish or the Dutch agency will report it to EMA, and then EMA will forward it to the drug company. The drug company would also have to send it to the, for example, the Japanese one, so PMDA, or the FDA, the US one. And so the different countries that have different, rules. So for example, if we needed to send it to the Chinese ones, so that's the National Medical Product Administration, that would typically then have to go through a local office, because the Chinese ones want it specifically in Chinese. So then the English report that we write, it needs to be translated at the local office, and that will then show the timeline even more, because then you need to add in extra days for translation and stuff. So that's a little bit about the reporting. There's a lot of guidelines for those, and then it's all very strict, and a lot of countries have it. Some countries are still in the process of developing their own guidelines, so sometimes they will be like copying other countries. So they will say, oh, these one wanted this, like within this timeline, we want the same. So some countries are also doing that. So how all these cases register? So as I said, our spontaneous reports, so ICSRs, they are sent to, for example, the EMA, the European Vigilance. It could be the FDA. So FDA, they got the FAIRS, so that's the Adverse Event Reporting System. And then we also got a World Health Organization, so that's the WHO's one, called Vigibase, which is located in Sweden, Uppsala Monitoring Center, so UMC. So we have those big, reporting systems, spontaneous reporting system, which contains a lot of these reports. So yeah, and throughout the years, like these databases, they just increases and increases, because there's just a lot of reports. So the size of these is huge. I think the WHO one is a couple of million reports, because it's been a fair amount of years now. And it includes everything that you would also have in the different spontaneous reports or case reports that we have talked about in the other slides. So they will have like drugs, so the suspected drug, but also drugs that were used by the patient at the same time. So those are the concomitant ones. So typically you would report everything so all the drugs that you're using, and then you have like one main drug. You also have all the different MEDRA terms, so all the different adverse events, or stuff like overdose would also be in there. Sometimes you would have lack of efficacy, so such things would also be in there. And then also like country and who reported. And maybe sometimes you'll be lucky, and then you'll also have some more patient-specific information. Sometimes you could also have like different diseases that the patient had, or maybe disease history from family that could also sometimes be included. So apart from these three big sources, which I mean they do overlap a little bit, so that's also what I've tried to show here with the circles. So there is some overlap between the three different databases. The ultravigilance one is primarily for the EU cases. So it's covering EU mainly. You have FAIRS, which is primarily US, and then you have Vigibase, which is worldwide. But there are some cases that are not in both of them, because you also saw on the timelines before that sometimes you'll distribute these reports to more than just this specific country or specific region, and that has something to do with which reports the different countries want. So some countries are like, okay, we specifically want every single serious case that is maybe pregnancy related. So then you would have to send all the pregnancy related cases, which is not specifically for that country, but just because that is what they want. So apart from these, which are more, how would I say, regulatory based, so FDA, EMA, and WHO, you also have the medical company's own spontaneous reporting system database. So that's usually a lot of the companies that use a specific system called Argus from Oracle, because it's been a very used one through like over a long period of time now. So it's also a very how to say good one, if you want to say. So they need to keep their own system with their own drugs to record all of these spontaneous reports. And then sometimes then they'll do some kind of reconciliation, so they will check or vigilance will then say, do you have these cases here? And then the company would have to say, yes, we have the same cases in our database, and sometimes the other way around, because the company is making some kind of cumulative report with everything in the database, basically. So now that we are in the EU, I'll try to give a very quick explanation of the ultravigilance, which is the EU version of the database. So we have, like, first of all, we have some kind of gateway, so our entry into the ultravigilance system. And then in that, we have all the, like, we have the ultravigilance database. So that is managed with that specific system called EVD-BMS. It's not something you need to remember specifically, but within that system, you have like the post-authorization module. So those are everything after the drug is on the market. So all the drugs that's already on the market. And then you also have a clinical trial module, which records everything clinical trial based. And then from that, you have also the web reporting application. So if we just go up from that, like you have different creations of the spontaneous cases. You have how to submit the cases and make some queries in it. You also have ways for the company, so that's the MAH, so that's the market authorization holder. So they can also download the cases. And then you also have a way for the NCA, that's the National Competent Authority, so a way to reroute the cases from ultravigilance to the different national competent authorities. So that is all part of the data collection part in the ultravigilance. Then for data management, if we just go from the database management system, so the greenish part, and just go down, You have some different ways for it to recode because everything needs to be in a specific data system. So it needs to be in a very specific way. We don't need to go into details about that. It's way too nitty gritty. Then we also have a data management part for the duplication detection because we only want each case in the system once. It doesn't really make sense to have it multiple times. Then that data from the database management system with like all the post-authorization cases and clinical trial cases, that is then extracted and transported and loaded with a process into the data warehouse. So that's where we do all the data analysis, and we have the data analysis system, EVDES. So that's what the jurisdictions use for all the signal detections and analyzation of the data. So they do all that analyzation, and then all of that data that they have analyzed and the signals is then accessed through the webpage adrreports.eu. So that is something that is publicly available. So that's the database for all the suspected adverse drug reaction reports. And that's also something that we can find as public. All of these, parts, they are entered in metro term. And so that's the standard terminology, as you can also see at the bottom. And then like the medicinal products, they're usually in ATC codes. Yeah. So if we then go to the next, this picture here. So here, this is a screenshot from adrreports.eu. So for this one specifically, I have searched for Imovec, which is a migraine drug. So the active ingredient for that is erinumab. And here you can just see like the number of individual cases or reports for different reaction groups. So for example, there's some general disorders and administration site conditions. So that could be like injection site numbness or something like that. You could have cardiac disorders, like you have some numbers for that, and also nervous system disorders. So you have a lot of different number of cases for the different reaction groups. And then you can also see how many of those are serious and how many of those were not reported serious. And then for some, it will also be not specified, but usually everything should be specified here. So this is just a very quick overview. And they also have different other things. So for example, they can look at the sex, they can look at the gender. No, that's the same. Sex and gender. They can look at ages. So what age was the person who received the drug and then got the adverse event, all of that stuff. And then you can also look more specifically in the different cases if that is needed. So now we can move on to the literature reviews and why it's important. So here I have put in a small snip from the European guidelines. So this is specifically the pharmacovigilance module. So they have different modules in the EMA, for the guideline of how everything pharmacovigilance should be conducted, and literature is part of that. So for example, the market, so they specify here specifically, marketing authorization holders are therefore expected to maintain awareness of possible publication through a systematic literature review of widely used reference databases. So that's, for example, Embase, PubMed, Medline, and so on. And it needs to be at least once a week. So this is specifically for the EU, so EMA. So they are saying you need to do it once a week. And then all of the reported suspected adverse reactions from the literature then needs to be identified and recorded as the ICSR. So that was the individual case stage reports that we entered into our reports database. So yeah, as I said, medical company needs to screen the literature for these cases, and they also need to screen it for benefit risk reports. So it's not just adverse event cases, but also like benefit risk reports that might be reported, because those two are not necessarily the same. But at the same time, there's also a lot of articles published every single year and sometimes even every single week. And because of this number of articles, the literature review is often outsourced to another company to do it. So I've come across, companies that have said that they are doing the literature review using machine learning. So they will first have it screened through computer to see if it's relevant or not, and then based on the algorithm that the um, um, algorithm score provides, then it will be either relevant or not, and then you'll have a human read through the article to see if it's actually a relevant case or not. And then that will then be sent to the company to be entered into the database. So why do we monitor all these different reports of adverse events? So here, this is from the CIOMS, so that's the Council for International Organizations for Medical Science. They define a signal as as information that arises from one or multiple sources, which suggests a new potential causal association or a new aspect of a known association between intervention and an event of said related events, either adverse or beneficial, that is judged to be sufficient likelihood to justify verificatory action. So these are one of the reasons that we need to monitor all of these cases reported to us. So all of these cases, they're used to generate signals. So for example, if we suddenly see a spike or a lot of new reports on a specific adverse events, and we don't have this adverse event stated in our patient leaflet, for example, or in any of our guides, then that is something we need to look at. So such event could be, I don't know, if we, for example, have a drug and then suddenly we see a lot of cases with brain hemorrhage, then that is something we need to look into to make sure that it's not our drug. And if it's our drug, then we need to make sure to state how we're going to manage this. So is that by taking the drug off the market, or is it like, do we know how this can happen? So we need to evaluate all of these kind of signals, and then that might then turn into a study or trial to actually investigate. So that is also what I have stated again here. So this is part of signal management. So when we detecting a signal, then we have to manage it. And here the aim of the signal management in pharmacovigilance, that is to determine whether there's a new risk associated with the drug, or whether the risk associated with the drug has changed or not. So those are the things that we need to manage, or what we want to find out. So based on this, so if we get like detect the risk, then we can do different things, like we can conduct studies or trials, and most importantly, we'll also look into our own database. So that's the database with all our cases to see how is all the other cases with this specific adverse event, what has happened in all of those, and how does it look in a bigger picture of everything. And then that is also what I've stated here. So one of the most common ways of signal detection in pharmacovigilance is by using these spontaneous reporting systems. So at a company, that will be using the data that the company have recorded themselves in their own database with all the different adverse events. So they will have a list of everything, or they have a database of everything, and then they will try to calculate for example, odds ratio on the different things, or other kind of measures to describe these adverse events. And other detections of the events could be during some of the periodic evaluation of the adverse events, or periodic evaluation of the drugs, because they need to evaluate the drugs on a fairly periodic basis. So some of them is 6-month basis, some of them is like yearly. It all depends on the like how old the drug is and how safe drug is. So a safer one that has been on the market for a long time usually isn't evaluated on a as frequent basis as the other ones. So all in all, just collect all the data and then somehow evaluate the adverse events to see if there is some kind of new signals in our data. So here I have tried to sketch the process up. So this is the signal management process at a company, typically in very, very condensed and rough way to condense it. So first we have the ICSRs, the clinical trials, and the literatures. So all of these adverse events, we have those in like one little box. And then all of these we're then using for the signal detection to see if we find something new. If we see a new signal, then we have to see if we can validate it or not. So that will typically be by like maybe looking at some literature to see if others have found anything similar, or you will look into your own data to see if there's anything there. If you cannot validate the signal, then it's a non-validated signal, and then you'll do nothing more about it than just writing a quick statement like, this is not validated, there was nothing to be seen here, blah, 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 and then that's it. You have to save it still, so you know that you have evaluated the signal, but otherwise nothing else is done with it. If the signal is then validated, then you'll further assess the signal. So then you'll like pull all the data you have together to see if you find something specific. If you like, and then you'll have to figure out if that's a new risk or if it changes the risk. So if it's not a new risk and it's not a change of risk, then you can refute the signal. So by like basically you're saying, okay, this is nothing new. We know this is the same risk as before, so nothing new there. Then nothing else happens to that. If it's a new risk or if it changes the risk of a specific event, then you have to propose different actions. So that's with the help of the regulatory team, and typically like it'll go higher up with also like the qualified person at the company. So that could be things such as changing the product information. So the leaflet, if it is the risk, if you need to add something there, if you need to amend something there. It could also be to create some risk minimization measures to, like, if this happens, then this is how we're going to manage this risk. So this is like a very condensed form of how the whole process of the signal management is.